Every day, the Bandwagon is revealed as more and more of a clown car, I would say. Jump aboard that clown car at your peril. It goes where clowns lead you. You know what I mean by the Bandwagon? The vehicle the various duped and gullible are herded onto for free rides onward to the confected cause or crisis of the moment. But like dominoes, those causes, those crises, they topple one after another. Like dominoes, they knock each other over because they're set up in a row by the same. When one falls, they all fall. Surely the next thing to fall off the bandwagon, along with presumably more and more of the embarrassed, chastened passengers, must be the wheels themselves on that old jalopy. Let's take, just as a for instance, the nonsense that has been the so-called climate crisis. Saints preserve us. American author and investigative journalist Michael Shellenberger took to X, Twitter, this week, and he put it this way, quote, "Climate change is an apocalyptic threat," they said. It wasn't, obviously, and now that Trump has exposed the Inflation Reduction Act, now, I should point out, that was the catch-all term for US investment in clean energy. But back to Shellenberger. And now that Trump has exposed the Inflation Reduction Act as a grift, and Greta Thunberg has moved on to Palestine, climate change is fading from view like overpopulation and past environmental scares, close quote. After global warming, and then when it was admitted the globe wasn't warming, we got climate crisis. And then when the crisis was revealed as nothing of the sort, along came climate change. After all that crap, most recently, we have been offered the altogether lame-sounding term climate variability. Are you aware of that one yet? Climate variability, which is the scientific equivalent, I would say, of maybe it'll rain tomorrow, maybe it won't. After all that crap, or whatever you call it, clearly the writing's on the wall for the climate hoaxers, at least for the time being. Show's over, folks. Get your coats and move along. Nothing to see here, you would say. Or perhaps we just realise, wait 5 minutes and the bandwagon will be along once more, ready to transport the baying mob to the next nonsense. In short, the climate crisis was just another hoax, a money-making grift for the usual suspects, and a handy stick with which to beat the long-suffering masses, an excuse to mug us for the subsidies for environmentally damaging windmills and toxic solar panels, while simultaneously having us blame ourselves for setting the world ablaze on account of our filthy habits of having children and eating meat and having gas boilers. Let me remind you once again that the acquisition of the stuff of batteries, your cobalt and lithium and the rest of the rare earth metals and minerals, all that stuff for electric car batteries, batteries for smartphones and laptops and the like, meant utterly devastating, irreplaceable ecosystems. Bolivia, the salt flats and all of that, these irreplaceable transit stations for migratory birds, whole lifetimes worth of need for all sorts of systems. All of that was to be ripped up, is to be ripped up, as well as turning a blind eye to wholesale child slavery in pursuit of cobalt in the Democratic Republic of Congo. But we're not supposed to talk about that either. Certainly not while riding along on the bandwagon. Notice, if you will, that brown people, brown babies, matter least when it comes to mining cobalt or being genocided in Gaza. While, strangely and paradoxically, straight, working-class, heterosexual Christian men and boys, talk about a minority, they matter least in the UK, at least when it comes to the sentencing of those judged guilty of crime, or will be the case from April Fool's Day, April the 1st, when new legislation comes into play. Now, as Michael Shellenberger points out, the climate crisis is fading away. Somehow or other it's been deemed past its sell-by date, not least because it's bollocks. Covid 1984, that was another hoax, as I've said on here until I'm blue in the face. The pandemic that wasn't, the disease that wasn't, that isn't. The bandwagon, nonetheless, carried billions of people to the needle so they could be injected with life-ending or life-limiting or life-damaging toxins. More and more people are realising that they were duped, that they were scammed, that they were made victims to the greatest crime ever committed against humanity. But rather than make a fuss, quietly, the masses disembark the bandwagon. So embarrassed are they, it makes the vast majority of them choose just to let bygones be bygones. Forget the harms done. And rather than demand justice, let's just put our heads down while the guilty move on to the next hoax. Back holding the reins of the bandwagon, our so-called leaders are still whipping up support for the obscenity that is their cynical, money-making Ukraine war horror show. Unelected, unaccountable European Union President Ursula von der Leyen calls for hundreds of billions of dollars worth of investment in the stuff of war. A murderously desperate pursuit of forever war in that benighted country. The defence of democracy in a country where there is none. The demand for our support of actual Nazis in direct lineage from those that committed the slaughter of Baba Yar and more besides. The perpetuation of a decades-long determination to provoke Russia, to provoke regime change in Russia so that that vast federation might be broken up and sold for parts. The whole sordid lot of it is based on nothing more than lies and the cynical pursuit of wealth and power by those that would sacrifice millions of lives so that their luxurious, sordid and perverted lifestyles might continue unabated and unquestioned. The determination to have the peoples of Western Europe hate Russia and the Russians, never mind what you think of Vladimir Putin and the Soviet Union, or indeed the Russian Federation, never mind what you think about that. We're told to hate Russia and the Russians, and it's yet another bandwagon. As if the Russians, the people, didn't suffer enough in the 20th century, for God's sake, when the Bolsheviks, who loathed the Russians, had their revenge on them and slaughtered tens of millions of them in an orgy of violence and sadism without equal in modern history. What happened in Russia after 1917 was the grim, relentless trundling of the same bandwagon that crushed uncounted lives in the name of the so-called French Revolution of the 18th and 19th centuries. Same show, different day. Both horrors, French and Russian revolutions, were the consequence of communism. Of course, isms are all the same. The first consonant is always irrelevant. It was only a difference in terms of the scale and ambition of the slaughter in the 20th century compared to the 18th, mostly because the mechanisms weren't there to get the job done to the same extent. Note to self, if you can find affiliation to the Fabian Society in the biography of a once or would-be leader, then know too that that individual considers you and me the carbon that must be reduced, the freedom that must be ended. At the peace conference in Yalta in 1945, US President Franklin Delano Roosevelt and British Prime Minister Winston Churchill granted psychopath Joe Stalin, and they knew then, even as they downed champagne and vodka with him, that he was a psychopath. They granted that monster half of Europe, half of the continent, thereby condemning hundreds of millions of souls to slavery and murder when there was absolutely no need to permit any such thing. They could have stopped it. They could have prevented it ever happening. Unknown hundreds of thousands, at least, fled before the rising black tide of Soviet rule in the East, desperate to cross into the West, across the line before they were submerged in it, only to be turned back by machine guns manned by Allied forces, serving Stalin's murderous desires. That's what we did then. All of that is on our account as well as Stalin's. Stalin declared that there were no Russian refugees waiting in displaced persons camps in the West, that those people were only deserters. And the Allies, which is us, dutifully stood by while Stalin's forces entered those camps and rounded up his prey and marched them, sometimes at bayonet point, onto trains that took them into oblivion. Many of those souls committed suicide on the way, rather than face what awaited them. Ask yourself why that happened, why we acted that way. In both cases, both the French and Russian revolutions, Christians were prime targets for torture and murder, as the revolutionaries, same communist ideology, different outfits, took that same old revenge on those that would be free. Interesting to note, by the by, that Judas, who, according to the story, betrayed Jesus for 30 pieces of silver, Judas was canonised, which is to say he was made a saint by revolutionaries in France and Russia both. Remember as well how democracy-loving Zelensky took the opportunity of NATO-driven war in his country to ban and demonise the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. I wonder why. By now, in the 21st century, the old thirst for vengeance on Russians, on Christians, on every symbol and sense of freedom grinds ever onwards, so that the latest generations of Western Europeans are supposed to jump aboard the bandwagon of Russophobia. Ask yourself why. Who does that serve? Asking us in Western Europe to hate Russian people because they're Russian. Why? I use terms like bandwagon, clown car, but it should go without saying that none of this has been or ever could be a laughing matter for those concerned. But with every passing day, every passing campaign of propaganda, every passing hoax, the reality of the bandwagon is more and more exposed. A friend of mine, South African Nick Hudson, has composed a heuristic, a teaching aid, you might say, that he calls, in tribute to Occam's razor, Hudson's razor. Nick says that if something is presented as a global crisis, for which only a one-size-fits-all global solution will do, and any questioning of, far less dissent in the face of the narrative, must be ruthlessly silenced and censored, then whatever it is, COVID, climate crisis, is a scam. Pure and simple. If those three boxes are ticked, you're dealing with a scam. More and more of us see this now. More and more of us look at our so-called leaders here in Britain and across Europe, elsewhere in the wider world, and see clowns fit only for riding in the clown car. Rich they most certainly are, those clowns. Wielding power granted them by their masters, they most certainly do. Likely, dangerous they still are, in the manner of sinister clowns. Clowns they are. Fewer and fewer people take their leaders seriously in the West. Democracy, at least as it's presented to us in these end-of-empire days, in the form of elections, has been revealed as another hoax. Elections are allowed to reach their conclusions. The votes only count if they deliver placemen and placewomen, pre-selected and coronated in advance by the faceless globalists. And those same elections bar from office anyone attracting the spontaneous and instinctive support of the electorate involved. You know the final destination of the bandwagon, don't you? The final destination for all those choosing to remain aboard. It's the digital gulag, the digital cage, the surveillance state. The answer to the question, what's it all about? What's going on? The answer to those questions is that it's all about getting the mass of the world and keeping the mass of the world so discombobulated by one thing after another that they'd rather slap the handcuffs on their own wrists than contemplate challenging the clowns behind the podiums. And those people behind the podiums are clowns, make no mistake. Well-paid, well-dressed, submissive clowns. They're paid and manipulated by those who despise you and me. And our so-called leaders, when you get right down to it, would perhaps prefer it that we were gone altogether, or at least entrapped once more in the feudalism, the slavery of old. It's time to get off the bandwagon, I say. Step away and watch it trundle towards the oblivion it deserves.